Well, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you're at today. Just want to welcome you today for our continuous webinar talking about continuous improvement when it comes to process safety management. Today's topic is going to be hot work, fairly short as compared to what we had last week. Last week we talked about mechanical integrity, and I want to say that I probably received a lot more emails after that webinar than I have on all of the others previous to that, with a lot of great questions regarding specifics on how to apply mechanical integrity to various processes. Obviously, PSM transcends a number of different processes from petrochemical, oil and gas, refining, and of course ammonia refrigeration as well. A number of questions were asked about risk-based inspections, particularly, and of course I have a pretty good background in risk-based inspections, so I'll be glad to answer those type of questions. And risk-based inspections apply to any industry, doesn't matter what industry that you're in. Certainly RBI can apply, and I always recommend that you move to an RBI type system so that you're focusing your resources on those higher risks. Obviously, PSM is all about managing risk, so we want to make sure that our resources are applied in the right areas. Today's topic, of course, will be hot work, and so let's go ahead and get started with that. So just give us a little background on what we've done thus far. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on this today, but we went through management system, basically who is supposed to do what. We've talked about employee participation, process safety information, and how important that is. Talked about the process hazards analysis, and obviously it comes after PSI, so making sure your process safety information is correct and current and accurate is a vital important piece of your PHA. We talked about operating procedures, training, contractors, pre-startup safety review. Last week, the last time we talked about mechanical integrity, and of course today is hot work. Just to give you a little bit of the code, here we've got two particular elements. The employer shall issue a hot work permit for hot work operations conducted on or near a covered process. So just because you may not have what you call a covered process, you could be doing hot work that's near a covered process, and therefore you must complete a permit. The second part is permit shall document that the fire prevention and protection requirements under 29 CFR 1910.252 have been implemented. And this really talks about what a Firewatch responsibilities are and what is required. And it also indicates the date authorized for the hot work, identify the object in which the hot work is being performed, and the permit shall be kept on file until completion of the hot work operations. This one's pretty important. A lot of facilities that I go into when we do compliance audits, I will ask for their previous hot work permits. Some of them will say, well, we only keep them up until the point where the hot work is completed, which according to the standard, the PSM standard, that would be perfectly fine. There's no requirement to keep it beyond the completion of the hot work operation itself. However, it's very difficult to audit a process when you have nothing to show that you've done that process. So a lot of times we will say if there's no documentation, you assume that it's not been done. There are other ways to get that information if they don't keep the permits on file. And normally what we'll do is we interview employees that have been involved in hot work. And typically that's where we get a lot more information rather than look at the permits themselves. So just because you don't keep those permits on file doesn't mean that you can't still find information that you need to find in order to audit that element. So what's the purpose and intent of hot work? It's really to control hot work hazards and risk. Again, we go back to PSM. PSM is all about managing risk. So that's what hot work, the intent of this particular element is to manage the hot work hazards and risk. It's to minimize and eliminate those risks when they're identified. And then it's to develop a permitting system. So you have a system that permits who and what and who is authorized to do that hot work. The other thing is to identify those hot work or Firewatch responsibilities and requirements. And we're going to get into more detail on all of this here in just a second. So some of the gaps, and these are typical gaps that we see in compliance audits. We're probably approaching a little over 300 compliance audits now that we have done here in the past 5-6 years. And so we're seeing, what we normally do is we document and keep track of that information as we do these audits. So some of the gaps that we're seeing is just a failure to complete a hot work permit altogether. That's 15% of all the audits. Again, we get this information through employee interviews and then actual on-site when we're doing a walkthrough, we may see somebody doing hot work and we'll actually ask them where their permit is. So others are failed to complete all portions of the permit as required. And this is 52% of the time. So that's a high number of incidents where they have a permit in place, but they failed to complete portions of that permit. If you have a permit and boxes aren't checked, etc., that is a violation of your own policies and procedures. So a part of PSM is making sure that if you have a policy and procedure in place, that you're following that procedure as you have identified. The other is a failure to conduct monitoring for hazardous conditions on inappropriate frequency. And this is 29% of the time. So what this means is most facilities will monitor for LEL, some will monitor for oxygen, some will monitor for other hazardous substances, I can't even say that word this morning, such as maybe H2S or ammonia or some other chemical that could be hazardous during the hot work operations themselves. So 29% of the time. And this is really also goes just beyond the initial monitoring, but also the periodic monitoring that should be done. A lot of facilities' policies and procedures indicate how frequent those monitoring, those tests should be done. And if they're not done according to their own policies and procedures, then that would be outside of compliance. The other thing is failure to provide a Firewatch. 58% of the time we see this. And this really goes beyond just having somebody there that's been provided as a Firewatch. But when a Firewatch is assigned, it means that that person's only duty is to be a Firewatch. If they are doing actual work, they are not a Firewatch. Even though you may designate that person as a Firewatch, if they're involved in the actual hot work itself, then they're not a Firewatch. A Firewatch is dedicated to, that's all they do is a Firewatch. The other thing, and this is 74% of the time, so this is a fairly high number. So nearly 3/4% of the time when a Firewatch is assigned, that Firewatch is not properly trained. And we're going to go into some of the detail of what we look at when we're looking for Firewatch training. Just because they know how to operate a fire extinguisher doesn't mean they're properly trained as a Firewatch. And we'll get into some of those details here in just a second. So what's the definition of hot work? It's any work involving burning, welding, or similar operations that are capable of initiating fires and explosions. That's the definition in its simplest form. So some of the hot work we see is in what we normally will indicate as actual hot work is welding and any allied processes, heat treating, grinding, thawing the pipe where you have an open flame, power driven fasteners. Typically they will put off some type of spark or mini explosion, hot riveting, any other spark, flame, or heat that is produced can and should fall under hot work. So you must have a written program, a hot work program in place, and it must be specific for your covered process. So in other words, it's not, can you take somebody else's hot work permit Process and apply it to yours. Yes, you may be able to do that with a few revisions, but for the most part, one person's hot work experience or one facility's hot work procedures and policies may not fit your organization or your facility. A hot work must be issued for all hot work. Doesn't matter if an employee is doing the hot work or a contractor is doing the hot work. A permit is required. The permit must be posted at the location of the hot work itself. A Firewatch is required, so there's no exceptions. If it's hot work, a Firewatch is required. A fire extinguisher, appropriate fire equipment must be provided in the immediate area, and the Firewatch must be trained in the use of that specific equipment. In general, we should check for available sprinklers in the area, make sure that the extinguishers are in service, obviously, and operable. You'd be surprised the number of times when we looked at hot work permits and actually watched hot work going on. And when we looked at the fire extinguisher was out of date or it wasn't properly charged. Hot work equipment is in good working condition. So what do we mean by that? Well, let's look at torches. Let's look at welding machines, for example. Maybe you look at grinders, making sure that that equipment is in good working conditions. For example, making sure that the welding leads, for example, are not frayed or have electrical circuits exposed, etc. Making sure that if it's an engine-driven welding machine, that it's running properly, they're not sparks being produced through the exhaust, etc. Also making sure that any cutting torches, for example, that the hoses are properly maintained, making sure that the torch itself is properly maintained, can shut off gas, both the fuel gas and oxygen, for example. Making sure that grinders, for example, make sure all of the guards are in place, making sure that the electrical wiring is not frayed, it's properly grounded, it has all of the ground plugs in place, is properly connected. So hot work, when it comes to looking at equipment, goes just beyond making sure that the area is clear, etc. You must examine and inspect the equipment itself to make sure it's in good working order. So in general, within 35 feet of hot work, you must ensure that flammable liquids, dust, lint, and oil deposits are removed. Explosive atmospheres in the area are eliminated. This really goes to speaking of monitoring the ambient conditions in the hot work area and within 35 feet of that hot work. Making sure that floors in the area is clean, making sure you don't have dirty rags and everything else, oily rags, etc., laying around, making sure that you don't have containment pallets that have oil in them, etc., are right next to the hot work area that you are going to be working in. Remove other combustible materials where possible, and you may have to protect them with factory mutual approved welding pads or blankets or curtains or fire resistant tarps or metal shields, etc. Wall and floor openings are covered, making sure that sparks and other hot materials can't fall down between the wall and floor openings and creating hazards in those conditions. Making sure that you have some factory mutual approved welding pads, blankets, and curtains are installed under and around the work as well. And that's important element. A lot of times within facilities that we go into, they will have multiple areas of work. So for example, they could be doing the hot work in elevated areas that are 3-4 floors up and have sparks that can fall all the way through down to the bottom floor. So making sure that you may have to have a fire watch at each one of those particular levels to make sure you're addressing any fire or potential fire issues. And also protect and shut down air ducts and intakes where you have air that's being exhausted from a building. There's potential for the sparks to go out those air ducts, then certainly we need to protect those as well. Hot work on walls, ceilings, and floors. Construction is non-combustible without combustible coverings or insulation. We want to make sure that if we're working on ceilings, et cetera, it should be non-combustible. If we're working on ceilings that are combustible, then we have to protect that through some factory mutual approved pads, et cetera. Combustible material on the other side of walls, ceilings, and roofs are moved away. About 8 months ago, we conducted an incident investigation where there was significant fire and loss of facility, where the hot work was being done on a roof. They had all of the right protections on the roof. They had a fire watch in place, et cetera. So they did all of the right things from the roof standpoint, but they didn't realize that on the other side of the roof was an open field. Well, they may have realized it, but didn't have a fire watch in that area or that could see that area. And what occurred is, as they were grinding, sparks flew off the roof down onto the dry grass on the other side of the roof, started a fire that eventually the whole area, because it was surrounded by an open field, also resulted in significant loss of materials, and also the building itself eventually caught on fire. So making sure that you look not beyond the area that you're actually doing the work, and making sure if it's on a roof, for example, make sure that you may need a fire watch on the other side of that roof as well. When it comes to hot work on enclosed equipment, obviously when enclosed equipment, it could be a confined space or it could be non-confined space, but regardless, enclosed equipment should be cleaned of all combustible materials. Containers are purged, obviously, of any flammable and liquid and vapors. And then pressurized vessel and piping should be removed from surface, isolated, and vented as well. And of course, it may fall under your confined space requirements. Confined space requirements are in addition to hot work, or vice versa. Confined space requirements come first, hot work in those would come second. So when it comes to Firewatch, let's just talk about what their requirements are. Their requirement is, and their responsibility is to monitor for the hot work, period, just to monitor. Firewatch operations, the hot work during the whole operation, 30 minutes after the work is completed. So once they start, they must remain there for 30 minutes after the work and during break activities as well. So this is one thing we see quite often. So the hot work is going on. The people doing the hot work decide, well, we're going to take a 15-minute break, and all of them leave, including the Firewatch. And the Firewatch must remain there during that break or 30 minutes thereafter. A sustainable fire extinguisher charged fire hose must be available. The Firewatch must be trained on the equipment, and this is the important one as well, is sounding the alarms, making sure that they know how to sound the alarm. Many times in our interviews doing compliance audit, we specifically ask that question: do you know how to sound the alarm? Oftentimes what we hear is, well, I would pull the fire alarm. Well, where is that fire alarm? I don't know. So if they don't know where those specific items are or how to sound those alarms, then they haven't met the requirement or have been trained properly in hot work. Firewatch may be required in adjoining areas. We talked about that here in a few minutes ago, where you may be doing hot work up on a roof, or you may be doing hot work in an elevated area. Maybe you need the Firewatch to be at the elevated area, but you also may need a Firewatch below to make sure that any sparks or any hot materials that are falling are addressed down there as well. So some of the management responsibilities are to provide employees with adequate training on the inherent risk involved. So we must train employees on hot work, and what are those risks involved? one of the things that I want to touch on here as well is making sure that contractors are trained in your hot work policies and procedures. Having generic training in hot work does not meet the requirement under PSM. So making sure that when you bring contractors into your facilities, they're trained on your hot work facilities or hot work policies and procedures, not in just generic ones. Emergency procedures should be in place in the event of a fire. Instructions on all equipment and processes, making sure that they're given those instructions, and recognize the responsibility for safe usage of cutting and welding equipment. A lot of times cutting and welding can be eliminated if we plan ahead and not have to use that type of equipment because of the risk involved. Ensure only approved equipment is used, making sure that we don't bring in devices that can create more hazards than we need them to create and to complete the job. So really the next steps that we always talk about is just making sure that you have in place is written hot work policies, procedures, and a permit system. Obviously, this is fairly simple to do, but you must have those in place, making sure that employees, hosts, and contractors are trained on those policies and procedures. There's nothing wrong with using a contractor's policies and procedures as long as you'd agree with those as a host. But making sure that those employees that are coming in doing that work are properly trained in those procedures. Making sure that your employees understand the hot work hazards, making sure that they know, there's potential for fire at elevated locations, and making sure that if they're doing work on a roof, so that there's proper protections that are not only made in that specific area on the roof itself, but any adjoining areas or even on ground floors. Making sure LEL monitoring or lower explosive limit monitoring, but that goes beyond just LEL monitoring. There might be other hazardous atmospheres that have to be addressed as well. And making sure that the Firewatch understands their responsibilities. And I just want to touch on this one maybe a little bit more, especially when it comes to Firewatch. And this is something we see quite often as well. When we train a Firewatch, and usually, let's step back to just a second. I will tell you that, and you'll have to examine your own facilities, but ask yourself, who is the person that typically is assigned the Firewatch responsibilities? And I will tell you that generally speaking, the lowest paid person and the newest person in the work group is the one assigned those responsibilities. As a result, typically also what occurs is that person is the one that's not trained. Also, what we see is that person's responsibility, especially here in Texas, and we see this probably in Oklahoma somewhat, and out west a little bit. The person that's assigned the Firewatch responsibilities, primary language is not English. So when that's particularly the case, we need to make sure that those persons are trained in the language of their primary language. If that's Spanish, if that's English, that's Vietnamese, et cetera, they must be trained in that specific language, and making sure that they understand what they should do in the event of emergency, what they should do in the event of a fire, and making sure that they understand their responsibilities as a Firewatch. Maybe that's through asking a few questions when they come on site. All of us that have been trained in the use of a fire extinguisher know a couple of things that are key in understanding how to use a fire extinguisher. If you're familiar with the PASS acronym, pull, if we understand the acronym itself, that's something that we can ask those employees when they come on site if they understand what it means when we say PASS. What does that mean? If they don't understand that particular acronym, and you should be asking yourself right now if you understand what that acronym is. If you understand what that is, we would expect those people that are doing Firewatch to understand what that acronym is as well. And that's one way to determine whether or not they've been trained. making sure that they know how to activate a fire alarm or what other warning they should provide if they have a fire that is beyond the incipient stage, so that they can get people, the proper people there to address that. Making sure the fire equipment is properly maintained. And that takes some training to make sure that people can actually understand what properly maintained equipment looks like. Not only the fire equipment, but also the welding equipment, the hot work equipment, making sure that they understand those hazards. What is a frayed wire? What is a frayed cable? What is a hose or a torch assembly look like in good condition versus bad conditions? And providing some training so that they have some, also including some verification of understanding in that training, so that we can ascertain whether or not they understand that training they were given as well. So management responsibilities, we already talked about some of this, but provide employees with adequate training on inherent risk. So we need to make sure that we're training our employees to make sure that they understand the risk associated with Firewatch or with hot work. And then what emergency procedures that are in place in the event of fire, what do we do? And making sure that your management systems are in place to be able to train and teach others as a result. Instructions on all equipment and processes, making sure that we understand how to use your equipment that you have in place. Not all fire equipment is the same in every facility. So we want to make sure that those you have systems and instructions in place on all equipment and processes. And of course, recognize the responsibility for safe usage of cutting and welding equipment. Ensure only approved equipment is used. Typically, we would see in many facilities where they have a list of approved equipment that might be used in hot work. For example, no open flames may be allowed, for example, in some locations. And only cold cutting is allowed rather than use of torches, et cetera. Sorry, I went backwards there. So really, that kind of concludes our webinar today on hot work. Next week, we're going to, or next webinar will be management change. I just want to make sure everybody attends that one. Management change is always a hot topic. We get quite a few questions about this. We just want to make sure everybody joins us for that. Let me just kind of go over a few questions that we have in the chat here, and I'll address those. If you have any questions, please put them in the chat for us. I think one question was, how long must a Firewatch remain? And I think we answered that as we went along here, and that's 30 minutes. And then here's one is, it says, does the person assigned Firewatch for a particular hot work have to be the same person through that hot work? No, they don't have to be the same person. That person can actually change, but they have that designated role. So if you want to change the hot work person, let's say a person ends their day at noon, and the hot work is continuing past the lunch period as long as you have that 30 minutes before and after, certainly that is going to apply. But also during breaks, somebody has to be involved in that hot work. Doesn't necessarily mean it has to be the same person, but that same person has the responsibility of making sure they've been properly trained, making sure that they understand all of their roles and responsibilities during that switchover. The other question is, hypothetically, if a hot work is going to be done over the course of 3 days, is it compliant to document the hot work permit for 72 hours instead of 1 for each day? Typically, that is not done. Typically, a hot work permit is good for 1 shift period. So whether your shift is 12 or 8 hours, then issue a new hot work because things change during that period of time. Again, it goes back to you developing your policy and procedures on how you're going to apply hot work in your facilities. making sure that the monitoring of ambient air conditions, for example, shouldn't go a total of 8 hours before you do that. You should be doing monitoring of that air at least at a minimum of every 4 hours to make sure that nothing has changed. And certainly I wouldn't allow a hot work permit to transcend multiple days or even multiple shifts for that matter, because those people and those personnel change as well. So we want to make sure that a new hot work permit is issued at least every shift change. Okay, I think that's all of the questions that I have. Feel free to email me if you have any questions at all, or certainly I'll leave the chat up here for a few more minutes. If you have any questions, I'll be glad to answer them then. Just again, want to invite you to come back for Management of Change. I think that'll be here in November sometime. And feel free to, again, send me any emails, not necessarily just on hot work. If you have any questions regarding PSM, RMP, I'll be glad to help and answer all of those, okay? Thank you so much. Again, I'll leave the Q&A or the chat up here for a few minutes. Feel free to ask your questions again or email me, and I'll take those questions as I get them. Thank you. Y'all have a great day. Good afternoon. Hope to see you next time.